Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to Quilt Along number 13. This week we're going to work on finishing our little heart and feather whole cloth quilt. And we do this with a couple of different steps, which includes soaking the quilt, blocking it, cutting it down, and then finally binding it. So let's see how this works on the machine. So the first step to finishing our whole cloth is to soak the quilt. And I filled up the bathtub with just a little bit of water, and I'm going to put the quilt in and let it soak for about 30 minutes. You don't need a lot of water because it's a pretty small quilt, but you need enough where all the chemicals that you use, starch and of course ink from your marking pens, has a place to go. So just leave it in there for about 10-15 minutes and then throw it in the dryer and let it tumble for a little bit to get most of the moisture out. You want the quilt to be a little damp for blocking. So now it's time to block the quilt. We soaked it, we've thrown it in the dryer and tumbled it for a bit, and now the quilt is kind of damp. It's not really wet, but it's not totally dry either. And what I've done is stretched it out over the surface of this tabletop using elastic straps. And you simply pin one side, stretch the elastic under the table, and then pin the other side, pulling on the elastic before you put the pen in so that the elastic is pulling the quilt and making it very nice and tight and flat. The purpose of this is simple. A whole cloth, when you throw it in the water, it's going to shrink and it's going to wrinkle, and we want it to dry flat so that way we can bind it, and of course it will look good on a wall or wherever you put it. The bigger the whole cloth is, the worse the shrinking and the wrinkling will be. So it's a very, very important step, not really particularly for our little whole cloth, but definitely for something if you try this on a bigger scale, a bigger quilt. So I've used these elastic strips. For something bigger, I would take down my design wall, which is 2-inch thick styrofoam boards, put that on the floor and put pins in it in order to stretch it and get it to the correct size. And how you know it's the correct size is before you throw it in the water, you want to measure from the edges of the motifs and record that measurement. So that's what you're stretching it out to. So I'm going to leave this here, maybe set up a fan overnight. Tomorrow morning it will be ready to cut down, square up, and bind. Now let's square this quilt top. We're first going to line up a long ruler with the edge of the heart motifs. You want to line up the 1-inch mark and trim off all that extra fabric and batting. We're trimming off to 1 inch, so that way if you want to make the quilt smaller, you can always trim it down later. It's always best, of course, to measure twice, cut once, because if you make a mistake here, it's really going to be noticeable. So be careful as you work your way around the quilt. Once you have the entire quilt cut down and squared, flip it over and get ready for binding. We're going to be binding with 2-inch wide binding strips, and this is straight grain binding that's just been folded in half and pressed. Of course, you're probably going to have to seam a few pieces together, and these seams are a little bit bigger and bulkier, so you want to place them in the middle of the edge of the quilt, not on the corners. So place that seam somewhere in the middle and then line up, kind of just generally line up those binding strips along the edges of the quilt. And while you're doing this, you're also trying to figure out where you're going to start stitching. And I'm just going to find that point right here, about 3 inches from a corner, and mark it with a pen. You don't need to pen all the rest of your binding at this point. That would be a little excessive, but you do want to make sure that you're going to leave at least 7 to 8 inches open so you have room to put those two loose ends of the binding together later. Now start stitching the binding on with a 1/4 of an inch seam by stitching forward and backwards to lock that beginning stitch. Now I'm going to fold up the edge of that binding on the corner just to get a kind of a crease line, and I'm going to place a pin above it approximately 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the quilt. Now just simply stitch down to that pin and stop right on the pin. Then back up. You're going to take some back stitches and forward stitches, and that's just going to lock that corner in place. Now here's how you fold the corner to create a beautiful miter. You're going to fold the binding strip straight up and press a 45-degree angle into the binding. Just do that with your fingers. Create that nice 45-degree angle. Then you're going to fold the binding straight down, matching all of the raw edges of that binding with the raw edges of your quilt. You're going to end up with a very nice kind of triangular shaped flappy thing right here, and all of the raw edges lined up perfectly. Now place a pin exactly 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the quilt, going from the top. And what's really nice in this situation, you have the stitching line kind of as a guide, because that's 1/4 of an inch, and you can just run your needle right through the stitching guide. Use that as a marker, more or less. Now you're going to put this back on the machine and start stitching right at that point. Stitch down a little bit, back up a bit, and stitch forward, and that's going to lock everything perfectly in place. Simply continue to stitch all the way around your quilt, binding each corner the exact same way. You want to make sure to maintain an accurate 1/4 of an inch seam allowance throughout this binding process. When you stop binding, you want to leave about 7 to 8 inches between the where you started and where you stopped. And take the left binding strip and spread it out. Make sure it's very nice and evenly spread on the quilt. And place a pin just to mark it. You're not actually pinning it to the quilt or anything like that. See, it's loose. You're not pinning it to anything, you're just simply marking that point. Now we're going to spread out the right strip on top, making sure everything is nice and smooth, no wrinkles. It helps to be very, very careful when it comes to putting these pieces together. Now I'm going to place another pin, marking exactly on top of the first pin. They're just simply marking pins. Now we're going to unfold both strips, and we're going to place the left strip on the bottom, and that's going to be right side up with fold side up. We're going to place the right strip with the fold side down. And we're going to line up that point in the fold where the pins were stuck. So we're just going to line these up right on top of each other and perfectly match where those pins were located. And then place a pin to keep these two binding strips in place. This seems a little complicated, but once you do it a few times, it really does make sense. The pins that you placed in the binding were simply holding them, really marking that point so you could line them up again, and then you'll be able to stitch them and everything will fit together absolutely perfectly. Now take out those marking pins and get ready to stitch a seam from the left to the right. We're going to stitch a seam right through there from left to right. So here we are. This is the navy blue binding in another quilt. I'm going to show you how this works. Just simply make sure you don't have any wrinkles in the binding. Going to get started right on that edge and start stitching. And you don't have to take your walking foot off unless you really want to. I just did this with the even feed foot on my machine since it was already installed. But just carefully stitch right across that binding. Once that's stitched, unfold it and press it against, just finger press it against the side of your quilt, making sure that you did not put any twists or wrinkles in that binding. If you're sure that you did it right, then it's time to trim off these loose edges. First, I like to finger press that seam open and then just trim off the tails of the binding. And of course, be very, very careful in this situation not to actually cut through your actual binding. I've done that before. Okay, once you get that trimmed, unfold your quilt, and you might want to finger press that seam open again. And then you're going to fold it all back up again, making sure it's nice and flat and even. And when you press it against your quilt, it should be perfect. I mean, just fit spectacularly close against your quilt. And all you have to do at that point is simply stitch that line from the beginning to the end, that open area. Just secure that area of the binding to the quilt. And here's what it looks like when that first step of binding is complete. Now for the second step of binding, and this is the part many people do by hand. No matter whether I'm doing it by hand or machine, I always take this to my ironing board and press the edges of the binding over, so that way I get a nice firm press and finish on either the right or the wrong side of the quilt. Remember, we were stitching the binding to the wrong side of the quilt, so we could flip it over and have the finish be on the right side. Now let's talk about this corner. We have a little bit of extra baggy fabric in this situation, and you want to fold it in this pattern just like this, and then tuck it in so you end up with this beautiful miter. And you might want to rewind this video a few times so you see how that fold worked. Now with the quilt on the right side, I'm going to carefully fold over the binding and place pins, working my way up to that corner. The more pins you place in it in this situation, the better. If I was hand binding, of course, I wouldn't need many pins at a time, but machine binding, you really need to get this very nicely secured so it doesn't become kind of crazy and wiggly on you when you get it on the machine. And then all you have to do is just simply tuck that little bit of excess binding up into that corner and fold it over, and you should have a perfect miter on the front as well as the back. Pin all of the edges and the corners in this manner so you have a very nice base to stitch whenever you take it to the machine. Start by pulling up your thread in the corner and select a stitch that will hit and secure the binding on the right hand swing of the needle, and then it will swing into just the plain quilt in the left hand swing of a needle. More simplistic machines, a zigzag stitch works just fine. Right now in this video I'm using a blanket stitch, which takes one stitch into the quilt and one stitch down on the edge of the binding. Whichever stitch you use, just make sure to maintain a very accurate stitch. You want to make sure that binding isn't wiggling around on you and showing the original stitching line for the binding. Here you can see I'm approaching a corner, which can be a really tricky area. You just want to make sure to keep everything nice and secure. It might even help to take a few hand stitches in this area before taking the quilt to the machine, simply because then you won't need to have all these pins in your way when you're stitching. Once you secure all of the corners, just simply hide your thread tails in the binding or the middle layer of the quilt, and your quilt will be finished. So that's it for this tutorial. I really hope that you'll get in your sewing room and finish up your little heart and feather haul cloth. Of course, in order to show you everything that I was showing you, I wasn't binding the heart and feather haul cloth, I was binding just this random panel. And the main reason for that is after I bound my entire heart and feather haul cloth, I took a look at it and looked at the videos and realized, well, everything just came out navy blue. So I used pretty wild colors in order for you to see everything that I was doing on this little sample, and I think that that was much better finished, so that way you can really hopefully understand how to finish off your quilt and how to bind it with machine. So have fun this week finishing this quilt off, and definitely link up your post from last week, micro stippling. Until next time, let's go quilt. If you're enjoying this video series, consider supporting the Free Motion Quilting Project with your order of tools or supplies from the Day Style Designs Quilt Shop. This is at daystyledesigns.com.